Trump faces off with woman veteran at Live press conference. His unexpected response shocks the nation. Have you ever given everything for your country, only to feel abandoned when you needed it most? Emma Carter knew that feeling all too well. She had spent years serving in the military, dedicating her life to protecting her country, making sacrifices most people couldn't even imagine. She had led missions, made split-second decisions that meant life or death, and stood shoulder to shoulder with her fellow soldiers in the most dangerous parts of the world. She had medals, commendations, and the kind of experience that should have opened doors for her the moment she returned home. But instead, she found herself standing at one closed door after another. At first, she was optimistic. She had believed the country she served would be there for her the way she had been there for it. She spent hours perfecting her resume, highlighting her leadership skills, her ability to adapt under pressure, her discipline, and her unwavering sense of duty. But none of it mattered. Every job application ended the same way. A polite rejection, an impersonal email, or worse, complete silence. Companies wanted candidates with industry experience. Some hiring managers hesitated when they saw the word veteran on her resume, as if it carried a hidden warning. Employers feared she wouldn't fit in with corporate culture, that her background in the military made her too rigid, too intense, or maybe even too broken. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Bills piled up. Her savings, which she had carefully put away while serving overseas, were disappearing fast. Every time she walked past a "help wanted" sign, she felt a bitter sting. It wasn't that she wasn't willing to work. She was more than willing. She was desperate. But no one was willing to give her a chance. The very country she had risked her life for had moved on without her. She stopped answering phone calls from the bank. She ignored the final notices in the mail. The night she found an eviction notice taped to her apartment door, she sank onto the floor, staring at it for what felt like hours. She had faced down enemies on the battlefield, survived situations that would have broken most people. But this helplessness, was something she had never been trained for. She was losing everything, and no one even noticed. She thought about reaching out for help, but pride held her back. She wasn't looking for a handout. She didn't want pity. She just wanted a fair shot, the same chance anyone else would get. But how could she make people listen? How could she make them understand what so many veterans like her were going through? Then, one night, as she sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, staring blankly at the flickering light of her television, something caught her attention. It was a live press conference. President Donald Trump stood at the podium, addressing the nation. He spoke about job growth, the economy, the future of America. But none of it felt real to her. None of it reflected what she and so many others were facing. And then, just like that, she knew what she had to do. It was reckless. It was probably a terrible idea. Security would be tight. She could be thrown out, or even arrested. But she didn't care. If no one would give her a chance, she would demand one. If no one was listening, she would make them listen. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt determination. She would go to that press conference. She would stand up in front of the most powerful man in the country and ask him one simple question. "Mr. President, what happens to soldiers like me when we come home?" She had no plan, no invitation, no guarantee that she would even make it inside. But she had nothing left to lose. And sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, that's when you find the courage to do the impossible. The morning air was sharp and unforgiving, the kind that seeped through layers of clothing and settled deep into the bones. Emma Carter sat on a worn-out bench near the White House, her hands shoved into the pockets of her thin jacket, trying to fight off the cold. The city around her moved with its usual rhythm. Cars rushing past, pedestrians lost in their own worlds, bundled up in coats and scarves, barely sparing a glance at the lone woman sitting motionless on the bench. She had never felt more invisible. Her fingers curled into fists inside her pockets, not from the cold, but from the weight pressing down on her chest. She had spent years in the military, leading missions, making split-second decisions that meant life or death. She had been trained to handle chaos, to stay calm under pressure, to be strong even when everything around her was falling apart. And yet, here she was, struggling with something as basic as survival. Her mind drifted back to the desert heat of Afghanistan, where she had once stood at the center of an operation, her radio crackling with updates from her team. She had been responsible for getting supplies through dangerous terrain, ensuring that soldiers on the front lines had what they needed to stay alive. The stakes had been high. Failure was never an option. She had made decisions in seconds that could mean life or death, had led people through the worst moments of their lives, and had done it all with a steady hand and an unshakable resolve. But none of that mattered now. The moment she took off her uniform, it was as if all those years of service had been erased. The country she had protected no longer had a place for her. She had walked into interviews with confidence, ready to prove herself, but it had always ended the same way. Polite smiles, empty reassurances, and a rejection email a few days later. They needed candidates with industry experience. They weren't sure how a military background would translate into their corporate world. They worried she wouldn't fit in. It didn't matter how capable she was, how disciplined, how experienced. She was always met with the same closed door. Her savings had disappeared faster than she thought possible. At first, she had been careful, stretching every dollar, convinced that something would come through soon. But the weeks turned into months, and the rejections piled up. She had tried to stay strong, telling herself that she would figure it out. But reality had a way of breaking through even the toughest walls. Her rent was overdue. Her fridge was empty. She had stopped answering phone calls from numbers she didn't recognize, knowing they were from bill collectors. And then, a few nights ago, the eviction notice had appeared on her door, a stark reminder that time was running out. She had no safety net, no family she could turn to for help. She was on her own. She shifted on the bench, pulling her coat tighter around her as a gust of wind sent dry leaves skittering across the sidewalk. Across the street, a group of tourists snapped photos, their laughter cutting through the morning quiet. They had no idea that just a few feet away, a woman who had once risked everything for this country was now fighting a silent battle just to stay afloat. She let out a slow breath, forcing herself to push back the frustration, the anger, the crushing feeling of failure. She needed to find a way forward. She needed to be heard. Her eyes drifted to a nearby newsstand, where a row of newspapers displayed bold headlines about the latest press conference happening that day. President Trump was addressing the nation. Jobs, the economy, the future of America. It was all there, printed in big letters, as if the country was thriving, as if people like her didn't exist. A spark of defiance flickered inside her. She had spent too long waiting for someone to notice her, too long hoping that things would change on their own. If no one was going to give her a chance, she was going to demand one. She glanced toward the White House, its towering presence standing in stark contrast to the emptiness she felt inside. It was reckless. It was probably a terrible idea, but she didn't care. She had nothing left to lose. She stood up, shaking off the cold, her breath visible in the crisp air. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have an invitation, but she had a voice, and she was going to use it. She was going to walk into that press conference, stand in front of the most powerful man in the country, and ask him one simple question. Mr. President, what happens to soldiers like me when we come home? She started walking, her steps firm, her jaw set. She didn't know what would happen when she got there, but one thing was certain. She was done being invisible. Emma walked with purpose, her heart pounding against her ribs as she approached the towering hotel where the press conference was being held. The sidewalk was packed with journalists, photographers, and officials, all moving in different directions, their voices blending into a steady hum of anticipation. Security officers stood at every entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring that only those with proper credentials were allowed inside. She didn't have a pass. She didn't have an invitation, but she had something no one else did: unshakable determination. She took a deep breath, watching a group of reporters flash their badges before being waved through. She had spent years navigating danger zones, adapting under pressure. This was no different. Without hesitation, she straightened her posture, adjusted the strap of her bag, and stepped forward, walking alongside a group of journalists as if she belonged. No one stopped her. No one questioned her presence. She moved with confidence, slipping through the doors unnoticed, her pulse racing as she found herself inside. The press conference hall was massive, its walls lined with cameras and microphones. Rows of chairs filled the space, occupied by journalists from every major news outlet. Some adjusted their recording equipment, others whispered among themselves, jotting down last-minute notes. At the front of the room, the stage stood tall, the iconic White House emblem displayed behind a single podium. It wouldn't be long before President Trump walked out. Emma kept her head down, moving toward the back of the room. She didn't need to be in the front row. She just needed to be here when the moment came. Taking a seat, she gripped the hem of her coat, her fingers twitching with nervous energy. She could hear the rhythmic clicking of cameras, the rustle of papers, the low murmurs of political analysts discussing what they expected to hear today. But she wasn't here for policy debates. She wasn't here to listen to rehearsed speeches. Minutes passed. Then, the energy in the room shifted. The quiet hum of voices faded as the backstage doors swung open. The clatter of cameras intensified. Journalists leaned forward, adjusting their microphones, ready to capture every word. Donald Trump stepped onto the stage, his signature confidence radiating as he approached the podium. He gave a nod to the audience, scanning the room before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today. We have many important issues to discuss, ranging from the economy and foreign policy to jobs and social welfare." Emma barely heard the rest. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the voices around her. She could feel the moment slipping away, the press conference moving forward, question after question being asked. Questions about trade, healthcare, international relations. None of it mattered to her. She clenched her fists, her breath shallow. This was it. If she didn't act now, she would remain invisible forever. The final question was asked. Trump answered briefly, then glanced toward his aides. One of them gave a small nod, signaling that the conference was over. "Thank you, everyone," Trump said, preparing to step away from the podium. Emma stood. "Mr. President." The packed room fell into a stunned silence. Every head snapped in her direction. Cameras whirled around, focusing on the unexpected voice. Journalists exchanged glances, whispering in confusion. On stage, Trump paused, raising an eyebrow. No one, especially not an unknown woman in the back of the room, was allowed to blurt out a question like that. Secret Service agents tensed, their bodies shifting, ready to intervene. But Emma didn't waver. She lifted her chin, her voice strong and unwavering. "My name is Emma Carter. I served in the United States military for years. I led missions. I protected this country. But now that I'm home, I can't find a job. No one will hire me. No one will even look at me. So tell me, Mr. President, what happens to soldiers like me once we're no longer needed?" The weight of her words pressed against the air, heavy and unshakable. The room was utterly still. A few reporters fumbled with their pens, quickly scribbling notes, realizing they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Camera flashes illuminated her face, capturing the raw emotion in her eyes. On stage, Trump studied her, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "What did you just say?" Emma clenched her fists, steadying her breath. "I said, what happens to us? We serve this country. We give everything we have. And then, when we come home, we have nothing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some reporters whispered in disbelief. Others exchanged glances filled with intrigue. This wasn't just another political question. This was real. This was raw. Trump tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes. "You're telling me you can't find a job?" Emma nodded. "Not just me. Thousands of veterans just like me. No one will hire us. Some think we're broken. Some think we can't adapt. But do you know what hurts the most, Mr. President? We gave our youth, our strength, our lives for this country, and when we come back, this country turns its back on us." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even Trump's closest advisors, normally quick to prep responses, glanced at each other, unsure. This wasn't a policy question they had expected. This was something else. Something real. Trump tapped his fingers against the podium, his gaze unwavering. Then, without warning, he took a step back, sat on the edge of the podium, and looked her straight in the eye. "Come up here." The entire room jolted. A few reporters inhaled sharply. Others scrambled to flip open their notebooks, desperate to record every word. Secret Service agents stiffened, their bodies tensing as if preparing for the unexpected. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. For a split second, she hesitated. Then, like a soldier responding to a direct order, she stepped forward. Emma's footsteps echoed across the polished floor as she moved toward the stage, her pulse racing with every step. The entire room was locked on her, the cameras capturing each movement, each breath. She had spent months being ignored, feeling invisible, but now, at this moment, the eyes of the entire nation were on her. Trump remained seated on the edge of the podium, watching her closely, his expression unreadable. The journalists in the room were frozen in place, their pens hovering over notepads, waiting for what would happen next. Some of them whispered to each other, unsure if this was planned, if this was some kind of publicity stunt. But Emma knew the truth. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't scripted. This was real. As she reached the stage, she squared her shoulders and met Trump's gaze head-on. He tapped his fingers against the podium, studying her. Then, in a voice calm but firm, he spoke again. "Are you saying you can't find a job?" Emma tightened her jaw, exhaling sharply. "I'm saying no one will give me a chance." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a frustration that had been building for months. "I led a logistics unit in Afghanistan. I was responsible for my team, for their safety, for making sure we had everything we needed to complete our missions. I worked under extreme pressure, made life-or-death decisions, but none of that seems to matter here. No company wants to hire a veteran. They look at my resume and see one thing: military. And just like that, they assume I can't adapt." Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against paper, while others typed at lightning speed. Camera flashes flickered, capturing the tension in the room. A few journalists whispered into their microphones, already broadcasting the moment live. Trump leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocked. "So what are they telling you?" Emma swallowed hard. "They say I don't have industry experience, that my skills don't translate, that I won't fit into corporate culture." She shook her head, frustration creeping into her tone. "But what they're really saying is that they don't know what to do with people like me. They don't understand us, so they shut us out." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some reporters exchanged glances, others whispered to their colleagues. Social media was already exploding, with people watching the live feed, commenting, reacting. Some were in shock that Trump had let this go on for so long. Others were waiting to see what he would do next. Trump was silent for a moment, then he stood up, adjusting his jacket. "You led a team in Afghanistan," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "You handled logistics, managed people, made critical decisions under pressure." He paused, nodding slightly. "Sounds like leadership to me." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had expected pushback, had braced herself for dismissal, for some rehearsed answer about government programs and job fairs. But this was different. Trump turned to face the crowd, scanning the room before looking back at her. "Tell me exactly what needs to change." The energy in the press room shifted. Reporters sat straighter, their fingers flying across keyboards, capturing the moment in real time. Some exchanged wide-eyed looks, others pressed their earpieces closer, relaying updates to their networks. This wasn't just another press conference anymore. This was something bigger. Emma took a slow, deep breath. This was her moment. This was her chance. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every veteran who had ever come home to a closed door. She met Trump's gaze, unflinching. "We need companies to see us as assets, not burdens. We need policies that push businesses to hire veterans, to train us if necessary. We need people to understand that serving in the military doesn't make us broken. It makes us stronger. We are disciplined, we are trained, and we know how to lead. We don't need a handout. We just need a way in." The room was silent, waiting for Trump's response. The camera zoomed in, the entire nation holding its breath. Then, after a long pause, Trump nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's fix it." The room was silent, but outside, the world was anything but. Millions of people across the country were watching the press conference live, their eyes glued to their screens as Emma Carter stood face to face with the President of the United States. Social media was in chaos. News outlets scrambled to push out headlines. Some people were in disbelief, others in awe. A simple press conference about policy had turned into a moment no one had seen coming. Trump's words hung in the air, his unexpected response sending shockwaves through the room. Reporters who had spent years covering politics, who had seen every kind of staged moment, sat frozen, unsure if what they had just witnessed was a carefully planned move or something completely unscripted. Camera flashes continued, capturing Emma's face, strong, determined, unshaken. She had not come here for attention. She had not come here looking for sympathy. She had come here demanding change. And now, the most powerful man in the country was listening. Trump straightened his jacket, scanning the sea of journalists before turning his attention back to Emma. His voice was firm, clear. "I'm going to make sure this problem is fixed," he said, and the entire room leaned in. Veterans should not be left behind. If companies won't give them a chance, then we will. He turned slightly toward one of his aides, who stood motionless at the edge of the stage. "Find out if there's an open position at the Department of Veterans Affairs." Gasps rippled through the audience. A few reporters exchanged stunned looks. Others scrambled to write down his words. Emma felt her breath hitch in her throat. She had come here ready to fight, ready to be ignored, ready to be escorted out by security. She had not expected this. Trump looked back at her. "You said you just need a way in," he said. "All right, here's your way in. Work with us. Help fix this from the inside." The moment the words left his mouth, the room exploded. Reporters shot up from their seats, voices clashing as they hurled questions toward the stage. "Is this a real job offer or just a publicity stunt? Mr. President, are you bypassing government hiring procedures? Emma, do you trust that this administration will follow through?" Emma stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden whirlwind of attention, but she did not waver. She met Trump's gaze, searching for any sign that this was just for show. But there was no hesitation in his expression, no carefully rehearsed political smile, just certainty. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. "If this is real, if this is an actual opportunity to make a difference, then yes, I accept." The room buzzed with urgency. Headlines flashed across news stations. "Breaking: Trump offers veteran government position on the spot." Twitter flooded with reactions. Some praised Emma for standing up, calling her a hero. Others were skeptical, questioning if this was just a moment of political theater. But one thing was undeniable. No one was ignoring her anymore. The moment spread like wildfire. Within hours, Emma Carter's name was everywhere. News anchors dissected the press conference, social media exploded with debates, and millions of Americans watched the clip of her confrontation with the president on repeat. Some called it a groundbreaking moment, a shift in how the country viewed its veterans. Others dismissed it as political theater, another headline that would fade in a few weeks. But for Emma, this wasn't about politics. This was real. Veterans across the country spoke up, sharing their own stories. Some had been out of the military for years, struggling to find stable work despite their experience. Others had given up entirely, forced into jobs far below their qualifications just to survive. "She said what we've been screaming for years," one veteran wrote in a viral post. "Maybe now someone will actually listen." Debates raged across news networks. "Did Trump just change history?" one headline read. Another asked, "Is this the moment veterans finally get the opportunities they deserve?" Political analysts argued over whether Trump's promise would turn into real action, whether Emma's appointment to the Department of Veterans Affairs was a genuine effort to fix the system or just a publicity move. But outside of the media frenzy, something far more important was happening. People were paying attention. For the first time in years, the struggles of veterans weren't being buried beneath other headlines. They were front and center, impossible to ignore. Emma, however, didn't have time to get lost in the noise. 2 days after the press conference, she stood in front of the massive Department of Veterans Affairs building, staring up at the glass doors that would lead her into an entirely new battlefield. The weight of what had happened still hadn't fully settled in. She had spent months feeling like no one saw her, like she was just another name lost in a system that didn't care. Now, she was stepping into the very heart of that system, not as an outsider, but as someone with the power to change it. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was busy, filled with government employees, veterans waiting for appointments, and officials moving from one meeting to the next. As she walked past the front desk, she could feel the stares. Some people recognized her from the news. Some whispered as she passed. She wasn't sure if they saw her as a hero or just another problem walking through the door. She didn't care. She wasn't here to be liked. She wasn't here for applause. She was here to fight for those who had been left behind, just like she had been. Her first day had barely begun, but she already knew one thing. This was just the start. Emma walked through the halls of the Department of Veterans Affairs, her footsteps steady, her purpose clear. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her, but she welcomed it. She had spent months searching for a way forward, and now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every veteran who had ever been ignored, for every soldier who had come home only to feel abandoned by the very country they had sworn to protect. Across the nation, people were still talking about her confrontation with the president. Some believed it was the start of real change, a turning point for veterans who had been overlooked for far too long. Others were skeptical, waiting to see if this was just another empty promise that would fade from the headlines. Emma didn't have the luxury of waiting. Change didn't come from headlines. It came from action. As she sat at her desk for the first time, she pulled out a worn piece of paper from her bag. It was a list she had made months ago, a list of veterans she had met who were still searching for work, still struggling, still fighting to be seen. She ran her fingers over the names, each one a reminder of why she was here. She wasn't going to let them down, because this wasn't just her fight. This was a fight for every veteran who had ever been forgotten. Would this moment bring real change? Only time would tell. But Emma Carter wasn't waiting for time to decide. She was here. She was ready. And she was just getting started.